you. Thank you, James. And please take a seat. No, I'm not letting you go. Sit down, please.
Deal.
Because we will continue with our conversation and we'll drill on this very pain point that so many traditional companies are facing.
Yes, you're talking about the challenge of corporate transformation. To discuss this topic, we have gathered a colorful bunch of experts here now on stage. We would like to welcome the CEO of Reinvent Group and one of the most successful poker stars of all time, Fedor Holz. The member of the board responsible for all things digital at REWE International, Christoph Matschke. A true veteran of the digital world who has led companies like HP, Apple or Sony into the area of digital marketing, Mr. Satjiv Chahil. And our moderator of the session, the most creative mind from Lake Constance and the managing director of Kreait, Max Giordano.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Thanks, James, for the keynote. I actually thought I'd get everyone on this excellent panel, well-curated panel, on top of our conversation by starting with a quote. So each one of you gets a quote. Would love to start with you, James. Actually, Woodrow Wilson said, if you really want to make enemies, you start to change. Now, you've been with Merck almost 3 years now, being appointed Chief Digital Officer at a very young age. Did you manage to get some enemies, or did you avoid it, and what are your lessons learned?
Yeah, I think anytime you approach any change topic, it is difficult, right? At least in the examples that we've been very successful in getting things through, the amount of grit I think it is required to push something through at a large company is definitely way higher than it is just to do it on your own. In my opinion, it's worth it, though. It's worth it in the sense that if you are at least have the courage to go through it and push through it, and it is brutal, right? The resources and the scale that you are afforded is something that you can't really get anywhere else. In terms of at least facing kind of enemies along the way, or people that are feeling or providing a lot of resistance, kind of the antibodies that you see, you know, in my mind, the key is to try to figure out what are the carrots that you can provide along the way. I don't think it's reasonable for someone to come into a big company and say, hey, I need a ton of money, I'm going to do this crazy thing that no one's done before, and you all don't get it, and why could you possibly ask me what my return is on this? You know? I mean, that to me is ludicrous, you know? That you should be able to go in and say, hey, we're going to work on these things. It's stuff that you're dealing with today. It could be super basic. Let me just provide you some information or give you a slightly better way of doing a prediction to allow you to do what you do better. And then suddenly they see their P&L improve, and they start adopting. You need to lead through example, I think. The science companies are good in the sense that they tend to be filled with scientists. Scientists can be stubborn, but scientists at least enjoy data. And the more data that you can show, the more you can kind of move forward with things.
Thank you. To move along, I mean, this morning we had a panel around the media industry, and the media industry is a great example of an industry that faces like digital change, and they feel it in their core product. Now with REWE, to have another quote is like, change is something that you do when you have no other options left. And now with REWE, you're doing tremendously well. You're one of the biggest employer in Austria. You're doing really, really good in profit and turnover. So how do you cope with that? How do you actually get into the mindset of the people if there is no urgency?
It's not always that easy. I mean, one thing is REWE has always been an innovative company. So in the last decades, we always were leading the business and driving the business. That means to be innovative is in a certain way in the DNA of our company, which is a good pre-setting. But apart from that, what's necessary? I mean, one thing all of you know, this is top management commitment, not just at the beginning, but during the whole process. You cannot too much point out that you believe in the digitalization, that the company needs the change. That's one thing. Secondly, you have to put together the teams, and you have to separate them in a reasonable way. There are different opportunities, but you have to separate them in a reasonable way from the existing organization, because otherwise their power will be absorbed by the old organization. You have to give them budgets. You have to, in an ideal world, you will relocate them, put them somewhere else, so that they really have a chance to concentrate on these new ideas. And to a reasonable level, you also, let's say, have to keep away all the torture instruments of a big company so that they really can work. I think you mentioned it in a certain way too. One other aspect which is important, I think at REWE, we are telling the people that our intention with the digitalization is not to replace people. We do not see that with the digitalization we will replace people in the stores. We will use the digitalization to develop instruments and technologies to give them the opportunity to better serve the customers. Mm-hmm. And especially for the colleagues in the stores, this is an important message that you have to pass on.
Mm-hmm. I want to get back to the notion that innovation needs to be separately. You just said it needs to be outside of the organization because you guys are located in Darmstadt, so I wanted to come back on that. But with Fedor, I have another quote for you, actually from Jack Welch, like change or be changed. Now, if I recall it right, I mean, you've been introduced as a professional poker player. Just to put it into perspective for everyone in the audience, not like a kind of like amateur player, like #1 worldwide, winning over $30 million, and basically winning all major tournaments, so that kind of poker player we're talking about. And then actively on the height of your career, you decided to do something else, which is creating an incubator. So change or be changed, what made you basically change, and now having basically produced an app about coaching, what kind of advice can you give a corporate from your perspective?
I think the thing that I learned the most in this, on my path as a poker player is that there were certain rules given by the game, like how you play the game, but I had the freedom to choose how I go about it. If I don't work on it, like I was free to put in 10 hours a day or 4 hours a day, like it was totally free to me. So this freedom and these opportunities, I think that showed me that it's like on me and I'm individually responsible. Mm-hmm. But also, I think it encouraged me because the feedback that I got and the results that I got was immediately like it was hooked to my performance. So if I put a lot of energy into it, then I got a lot out of it. And that was the first time until that point in my life where there was such a clear feedback loop of me putting in a certain amount of time and work and effort, and then getting a certain result out of it. And that was where I then started to actually become really creative about what kind of solutions I can apply and how I can go about it. And to get back to your question, the reason why I felt like change was because I felt this part was missing. So I reached a certain level of play, and I got one of the best, but I reached a certain ceiling. So there was not so much progress anymore. I didn't develop so much anymore. And that was the part that I valued the most about this experience. So yes, I was on the point where I was financially most successful, but it didn't feel, in my personal value system, it just felt more, the value of learning and the value of growing and my process improving was more important to me than the financial profit. So that was at the point where I reached my pinnacle. I didn't feel like I was progressing, so I felt, okay, I have to explore other options. Mm-hmm.
Interesting. I see a lot of relevance actually for the corporate world. I mean, just to touch on two things. Like one is like the incentivation. Like it's not only about the money. So what we see in many industries is that, especially with the millennial workforce coming to play, people talking about, okay, what's actually the purpose of the company? What's the purpose of my job, etc. And the other thing you mentioned, like having a feedback loop of what you created. I put stuff into it, and then you get the results out of that. So that's often a problem working for a big corporation if you're just like a little tool within there. Getting you on board, I mean, you've been really like a marketing legend to probably introduce you. It's really worth reading his Wikipedia page, which is super impressive, I have to say so. Just one highlight, like you started the multimedia division for Apple back then and been a real pioneer on marketing. Now, the quote for you actually is in the little booklet that each one of you have, and it's actually the Darwin quote, which I think is quite amazing, looking back at your over 30 years in the industry, looking back at Silicon Valley, where you live. Like, it's not the most intelligent and the strongest companies in Silicon Valley. It's also the one, basically it's the one most responsive to change. So what's your take on that? What is the lessons learned that you had in 30 years of Silicon Valley? What does an Apple differentiate from the Palm of this world or the Nokias?
Actually, first just going back to the Charles Darwin quote, luckily I was not the strongest or the most intelligent. So I had the opportunity to look at change.
Yeah.
And so the opportunity, and actually it'll be interesting for people here. In the early 90s, the PC market was considered saturated. Apple had achieved the highest market share at the time. And that's when I happened to notice technologies in our labs that allowed moving images and sound to come out of computers. And it's probably hard to think of Apple that way, but those days Apple was obsessed with making the spreadsheet go faster than IBM PCs. And I saw these moving images. I thought, my God, this thing changed everything. And so why don't we redefine the computer? And I was fortunate, as you mentioned, that the leaders of Apple bought into the idea, but they realized we couldn't fight our own corporation. So I was set up in a new division called New Media, New Markets. And actually, I visited all the European media companies to tell them there'll be more websites than media companies, and that their world was about to change, and everybody thought I was an interesting guy, and nothing ever happened. So but we proceeded sort of within the large company. My first sort of program was building CD-ROM that would allow images to work, and designing sound to come out of speakers. And again, the lady from Tencent talked about the corporation was really not interested in what I was doing. So I had to create an ecosystem. So I had to go to the publishers, I had to go to the music entertainment companies and show them new possibility. So I got to work with Peter Gabriel to create the first music CD-ROM. So as people from different industries, they were happy to come join a new ecosystem. And the thought was you could raise the tide for all boats to rise. So that is how we, so my little division was also full of many enthusiastic people, mostly of my age those days in the 30s. We were kind of old and didn't get it easily. So one day I asked my staff if they had teenage kids to bring them to work. So they'd bring them to work on Friday. All of a sudden, the kids would immediately get everything. And so, got a long story short, we took off, and the whole company redefined. And as you were saying, we could help all the related businesses also increase. So it was not threatening, but it was not easy. If we tried to change from within, the revenue priorities were elsewhere. So you could, I would be a distraction to the core, and that's the hardest part.
So let's open up the conversation. You just mentioned something. Apple was doing good, and by opening up, by looking into partnerships, by bringing people outside in, you basically became like a force to make this company so really tremendously successful. So what about your daily like operations? Like if you look at that point, like working together with external companies, I'm looking at you, James, with Merck. Where do you get your ideas from? Is it by working internally, working externally?
I think a lot of this stuff comes from just paying attention to where pain is, A lot of big cultural change pieces that I think we've had have come from just looking and saying, like, why is it taking you so long to do that? That's what it is, And identifying those as areas where you can start applying some type of technology to it, or at least solving these problems, and then taking that same approach outside. I think most of the ideas just come from watching people and trying to simplify it down into what is this core problem that we were trying to solve, and then if we solve this problem, one, can we scale it, and two, what does a transaction look like around it, right? I mentioned that kind of explicitly because I think at a large company, to get something through, there needs to be some understanding, and there needs to be a simplicity and clarity around what the business model and the transaction is, that you might not necessarily need if you were just doing it as a startup, but that I see as a really critical kind of component of it. Because if you can't explain what that is to someone, frankly, I wouldn't give them money to do that, right? And so the simpler that we can frame it, the simpler we can show this is exactly what the transaction is, this is the clear pain that we observe, and this is the scale of the opportunity, makes it a very simple story to kind of get through and get approved. But it's really simplifying down to these core issues.
But I'm just curious, how does a day for a chief digital officer at Merck look like when you're saying like it's about noticing problems? Like what's your day look like?
I don't think there is a typical day. I don't think I've been in the same place for more than 2 days in the last 3 months. So like
let me reframe it. So let me reframe it. How
do
you identify the problems? How do you identify what's needed?
Usually it's our team that's finding them.
Okay.
We have a very big data science team that is very acutely aware of just going and asking why, and they are going everywhere and just trying to figure out why stuff is happening the way that it is, right? And really just trying to get to the core of these problems. And so I try to spend as much time as I can with the engineers that we have. On the other side, it's also trying to manage at least the expectations of the folks that we work with that, hey, we're not building a social media account for you, right? But we'd be happy to build like a really great predictive model for this specific go-to-market thing that you have, and we think this is really valuable. Or we have an idea for new business, and we're trying to get the other parties together to try to figure out how you get the water to rise for everyone around, because those are really compelling cases.
I mean, speaking of new ideas, Christoph, like REWE is really considered to be on the forefront of like improving stuff with their stores, etc. How does the process look for a company like REWE? If you have an innovative idea, how do you test it in the market? How do you get it back within the organization?
Well, I think, first of all, you need the people who have the idea, exactly what you have just mentioned. And as I said, therefore, you need a separate organization who has the possibilities to play with these ideas. Secondly, then, is really test it, whatever you have. You can test it in the stores. I mean, you can test it in an environment. You can test it from a technical point of view. And then be not afraid if something doesn't work to stop it. And test the next stuff again. That is, I think, an important attitude, behavior of an organization. And another aspect that's also important, you need to have spotlights in your organization. You need to have projects which you can communicate to your thousands of people that you have. For example, when we opened a year ago our first food fulfillment center here in Vienna, we used all our existing communication channels that we have with our employees to tell them, hey, here's something happening. We did a next big step and just take a look what's going on. And another thing is also that we try to make digitalization somehow in small parts a part of the all-day business for our colleagues, especially in the stores. We're having 80,000 employees, and we have digital natives. Sure, it's easy with them. Yeah, our apprentices, when they have to learn about all the stuff about the goods that we are selling, we developed an app, and now it's kind of a gamification for them. That's for sure more interesting for them to work with an app to learn the differences between milk, cheese, and all that stuff than reading it in the books. It's easy to do it with them. But for example, we also have a lot of people who are not digital natives. And how can we make them, let's say, familiar with that? One of our divisions, the supermarket division, Billa, has an employee app. I guess 1/3 of our employees are using it. And the most used tool of this app is you can take a look at the shift plan for the next week. It's very easy. It might not even be interesting for you, but what is it? It gives a chance for one of our people working in the store to have an idea what digitalization might mean and what is an advantage for him. I don't have to walk in the office. I don't have to call the company. I can take a look at my phone and there's the shift plan for next week. And you need a lot more of that, and that somehow then drives the transformation process a little bit.
So let's stay with HR for a bit and the cultural setup. I mean, Fedor, you're running your own incubator, so basically it's really up to you to define the culture of the company. You can basically create whatever kind of workspace that you want. What is your experience? What is a nice environment for people to join your company, to work with you? What's some lessons learned, what really worked out well?
I think one of the things we learned over the last 2 years specifically was to not try to define too much.
Okay.
Especially because I think that's the biggest change that is happening right now. Is I think that structures are changing so fast, and that we will never be at a point in time where we will change like slower than we are right now. And I think we really have to realize that structures are not gonna change slower. Like we will just accelerate. We will just like not linearly but exponentially, and so really give that room for these structures to actually have that mechanism for them to be flexibly growing and changing, and not trying to like iterate like non-flexible structures, but give that room. And I think that's why our focus is on the environment and not necessarily on the content inside. So we try to give the best environment, whether that's a space or input, or like get new people from the outside, whether that's interesting content, or like speakers or coaches or mentors or investors, and not necessarily try to tell them like, okay, you have to follow this script, or this is the blueprint, because their ideas in like 6 months, 12 months are already outpacing the ideas we had at this point in time. And so really that focus on the environment and not necessarily the focus on the content itself, I think that's the biggest shift I perceived from companies that I observed or partly worked in as well, to what we are doing and planning to do.
Focus on an environment. Is that something you guys could agree on? I mean, Satjiv, you're seeing such a wide range of companies, if I recall it right, both from the startup side but also big corporations.
Right.
Like, what is an inspiring environment for innovation, for change?
Actually, you just said the key word. It's inspiration that leads to change. Because the biggest curse, I always say, for large corporations is their past success. So you're so successful, you're scared to change anything. And there's a saying in America, they say, don't touch it if it ain't broke. And actually, it's the opposite of what the CEO of Intel used to say, only the paranoid survive. So the point is that most of the large companies, not just in Europe, around the world, are refined to perfection based on the industrial age. They are not in the digital or information age. So every process, everything, is to put out a quality product in an industrial era. The people today in the digital age think laterally. They don't think silos. And these companies are all siloed, both business-wise, function-wise. And if you look at how you talk of Amazon, people go everywhere simultaneously. They make decisions differently. But the decision makers of the large companies are out of date. So that is, and yet they realize, and they appoint chief digital officers, but his job, in a way, is to transform the whole company, but he does it in a step way that nobody feels disrupted. Yeah, but that's what needs to be done to go into the future. So I get invited by literally the largest companies, but even at the top, you have old feudal lords. You know, you have families that own businesses, and so everybody is scared, and that's the challenge in the large companies. And then a crazy guy like Elon Musk redefines everything. Now the whole industry is chasing him, you know? And so I usually say that what happens in large companies, they set up processes to achieve a purpose, and they refine the processes. In time, the processes rule, the purpose is lost. So you got to focus back on the purpose, the customer who you deal with, etc. Understand all the new digital technologies, both from a hardware, software, application standpoint, and see how do you employ those technologies to serve your customers the best, make your businesses more efficient. So it's a massive rethink that needs to happen. And if it doesn't happen, new companies emerge, old ones die. And it even happens to the tech industry. So if you go to how many people have been to Facebook headquarters?
Facebook headquarters?
If you see the sign outside, with the thumb up, one. On the back side of the sign is Sun Microsystems. That was the company that occupied the space. So it's a reminder that any of them could vanish any day. MySpace preceded Facebook. InfoSeek preceded Google. So everybody's life can change. The consumers are more and more in control, and they're completely digital.
So looking at REWE and Merck, I mean, fighting the silos, staying innovative, because it's easier said to be done.
As I said, yeah, we also separated these groups and these departments, which is a very important step. What's also important, but you have to take care that they're not fighting with each other, and you have to translate between both groups. For example, in the IT department, one of our kernels of our IT system was built around 25 years ago, and it's working on on Oracle Forms. And those guys who developed the system are now around, let's say, 50, 55 years old. They are very proud of what they have done, with good reasons, because they have a very efficient system, and it's serving the main part of our company. Now we have younger guys, 30 years old, who don't even want to work with Oracle Forms because it's not very sexy. They like the other applications. And now you really have to say, you have to take care that they're not just fighting against each other. The young guys have to understand that their older colleagues did also a very good job, and they might also have some ideas and some knowledge that is important for them. And at the same time, for sure, the rookies also have a lot of ideas and a lot of good ideas, and it does make sense to listen to them because they might sometimes come up with solutions the experienced ones do not think about. So I think you have to separate them, absolutely no doubt, but you also have to take care where are possible connections between them. And I'm convinced with the biggest part of our organization, we can learn a lot from the young colleagues who are working in this incubator.
You want to add something? Or?
Yeah, I don't know, our approach is sort of opposite all of the things that you would think would be very helpful, like kind of separating these things. I mean, yes, we're separated in a sense, but we really try to integrate as much as possible with the businesses to be able to show that you can create something. I think when I think of one of the biggest gaps that I see between particularly new tech companies and large older companies is it sounds so stupid and so basic, but just feedback loops. Like, do you have a real-time feedback loop, or are you doing an experiment that you're going to find the result of in 6 months? Like, we were very fortunate in the sense that we had a massive e-commerce site, right? I mean, a couple of years ago, if you looked at like the top 30 e-commerce sites and you compared our revenue, we would have been one of the top 30 e-commerce sites by revenue, but we would have never even acknowledged this ourselves, right?
That's Sigma Aldrich, right?
At Sigma Aldrich,
yeah.
And I think back to like what were the most radical changes that we had at Sigma, right? Radical change number one was when our data scientists went from accessing data on hard drives that they would have to basically put their query in, so they do their sampling, reduce the set down to the sample set, and then overnight they would run their analysis across the data set, and then the next morning you would get back the result, and you'd be like, I was wrong, or I want to change it, or I want to do the next thing, and then you wait till that night to then run the experiment till the next day. And this is probably 10 years ago. And then, like, overnight, all of a sudden, we had massive in-memory computing. We had done something with SGI and had, like, a machine with, like, 64 terabytes of RAM in a single machine. It was the coolest thing ever, right? Because we're like, we don't have to sample anymore, right? You just do it across everything, and you get the result back in a second, right? And then the next radical change was when we moved to entirely kind of cloud computing platforms with all kind of in-memory computing on these, where suddenly I could run a recommendation set, and I'm running kind of the same analysis. I'm picking how long I want it to take, and then spinning up however many machines I need to run it, and then I'm feeding it back to that user at that moment, and that user is telling me yes or no, you're right or wrong, right? And with each of those kind of changes, and when is your feedback cycle, you can start exponentially improving, because you can just tinker, right? And that tinkering, you can just keep moving it up. Most large
companies
companies,
data part of your talk, like
exactly
doing not based on assumptions, but really data driven.
Exactly, because if you go to a board of any large company, why do you think this? right? What makes you believe this thing can work, right? Or you want to do this, you want an investment, why? If you can show, hey, this is what we thought, this is what we tested, this is what the result is, it's very basic logic. There's no board in the world who is going to be like, you're wrong, I don't believe data, I don't believe it's science. Typically, those are pushed out pretty quickly, right? But I think the problem is, at new tech companies, you're building this from the start. You have one place to get this information. All of this information is coming in very easily. At very large companies, this information is scattered in hundreds, if not thousands, of different systems of varying ages, of varying update intervals, and some of it's even still on paper, right, in certain places. So it's a horribly unsexy problem to try to figure that out, but there is no AI black box that's going to sort out that problem for you. I mean, if you sit down with any of these systems, it's like, feed in the structured data, tell me what facets are important, output prediction out of black box. Cool. My problem is like this first thing. How do I just get this in such a way that I can input it? I mean, Chris Booth from earlier with Argo has one of the more pragmatic approaches, I think, to trying to do this. But I think people really underestimate what that means. If it is that fractured, if it is that scattered, your time of innovation just extends further and further.
Did Chris Booth mention the anecdote with Angela Merkel on stage this morning?
No, just I know Argo.
Just for the audience, so Chris Booth is advisor to Chancellor Merkel, and there is this anecdote where he basically introduced like a new project he's working on for the government, a database. And Angela Merkel asked him like, "So cool, can we see it next year?" And he said like, "No, in the next meeting." It's done in a few weeks. Like the world Chris Booth is coming from is talking about weeks and data and not years. But coming back to your point.
Can I just add?
Yeah, sure.
So I get similarly invited to the top corporations here, and I make some suggestions, and they say, okay, let's meet again next year. I said, you got to be kidding.
Yeah, let's meet next week, not next year. But James, coming back to what you said, because we touched about where does innovation need to come from? Is it within the headquarters? Merck is headquartered in Darmstadt, so would you say you have to be within the headquarters? You need to be there? Because the opposite is often like, oh, we need to be in San Francisco, we need to be in Tel Aviv, we need to be in Berlin, we need to be in Vienna, wherever there is access to workforce, access to startups, etc. So what's your point on?
I mean, for me, we don't have to be in San Francisco, realistically. We don't need to be in any of this. We need to be somewhere where you have people who can actually do it, right? And not people who can talk about it, right?
But my point is, how important is it to have access to the headquarters? Like, how important is it for you on your day job? Like, you need to have like the 1 minute walk to be in front of an executive board or something. How important is it?
I think it's more important from a cultural perspective of being able to send a message to a company. I mean, we have 10,000 people just at our Darmstadt office, right? And so from a headquarter perspective, it's critical just to get people feeling like there is shit, feeling like something can be done, feeling like you can move. At the same time, you have a lot of skeptical people in this process. I generally believe that there's a misunderstanding around kind of innovation at large companies in the sense that I think a lot of folks feel like the problem is a lack of ideas. And you need to come up with ways to create environments for idea generation. I mean, I can send a note out to any Merck listserv and get back 45,000 ideas in 10 seconds, a lot of which will be fantastic ideas. We are overflowing with ideas, and every large company that I've gone to and talked to is overflowing with large ideas. What is lacking is somebody who's taking one of those ideas, only one of those ideas, and then like ruthlessly focusing on it and doing it and surrounded by the people who can do it, right? And so I think it's creating that appropriate balance of fostering kind of this new thinking, getting people excited, but simultaneously being able to pluck out those one or two hyper-scalable things that are meaningful. And by meaningful, from my perspective, it means you are not a rounding error on a balance sheet, right? If this huge thing that you want to do at the end of the day is going to equal less than the rounding error on your company's annual report, there is nobody who's going to care about it, right? So it needs to be scalable, it needs to be meaningful, and it needs to be tangible. And then just focus and do it, you know?
Unfortunately, we're slowly running out of time, but I want to close around because you just mentioned it's about the ideas and where ideas coming from. And on that note, we often hear about, okay, big corporates need to be closer to startups, need to work with startups. So each one of you, you have experience with your incubator, you're working with from the outside in with a corporate. With REWE, you're working as a corporate with startups. You're a bridge between the startups and the corporates. So just a quick highlight at the end. What's your notion about big corporate working with startup? What are some lessons learned? What works well? What doesn't work well?
I would say it's absolutely the right approach. I mean, we're working with startups. It's interesting to see their ideas. It's interesting to see how they are working. So why shouldn't we do? I think somehow, for me, it's just natural to do it.
But how do we do it well? How do we do it right? What were some lessons learned that didn't work out for both sides, for both REWE and the other partner?
How do you do it right? I mean, you have to give them, if an idea is good, you have to give attention, you have to pay attention to them, that they get the chance to develop the idea, and then sooner or later you must transform this idea within the existing organization. I think this is important.
Would you agree, Fedor?
I personally think I agree with a lot of the things that have been said here. I think the biggest thing, I think that really refers to what you said, is the cultural change. I think from a technological perspective, there's certain things that startups bring in, but not because they're most of the time not technologically more advanced, but just because they think about it in a different way. I think they approach the ideas in a different way, they go about it in a different way, and I think this is the value about it, not necessarily the skill set, that's a part of it, but I think it's more how they implement these ideas, or how they go after these ideas and how they execute these ideas. Yeah. I think this is really also what we try to foster in our community, in our environment, is to foster that failing that you said as well, is that failing is all around, and it's like the most common and appreciated things, because if you fail something, that means new information comes in, and information is the most valuable thing we can have in such a community. So I think really this fostering this mindset that people just constantly fail, constantly get new information in, share, I think that's an extremely important thing as well. That's why I'm not such a big fan of the silo idea. I think it's important to have people right beside them to see that there's someone doing it in a different way. And once you see the result, and once you see how they feel with it and how they behave, then I think you start adapting, because you see the positive things in it and you copy the positive things. So I think it's really important to focus on that mindset.
How about from your perspective, in closing remarks?
Yeah, the key is to integrating it through the organization to see it's implemented. Because many times they're left, or the integration takes so long that people leave. So you lose the talent that created it. So integrating it, making sure the sponsorship comes from the leadership is very key. And then, as they did with him, they changed the bigger corporation through the acquisition. And so that's the model.
So thank you so much. I try to quickly wrap it up. Partnerships. You really benefited from partnerships. It's really about also getting the external stimulus into the organization. It's about breaking the silos, and it's about bringing change within the entire organization. I hope I did a good job in wrapping it up.
Perfect.
Working with startups is a really interesting way to get innovation on board. Also like to have tools and services to get the entire workforce in place, because you mentioned you have from the millennials all the way to people close to retirement, having tools and services to get them, also to be open for change, because you are basically a very strong company and you don't feel the threat. So thinking way ahead. Hopefully I did a good job in wrapping that up.
Excellent, yep.
Fedor, it's all about culture. It's about creating an environment that's really stimulating to the people. It's about also having kind of like a failure culture, like fail fast, hopefully fail cheap. Having failure as an option, which is very difficult if you come from a corporate perspective, because failure is not in the DNA. I hope I did a good job in wrapping that up.
Yeah, thank you.
And James, there was a ton. Data-informed decisions, so decisions not based on assumptions, but really do the math, look at the data, look at it, improve it, look at the customer, really look what's required. Best ideas are coming from where there is like a problem. And I really liked your charts at the end because like strong corporations, they are good. It's not about that they're, you know, we don't, especially in Europe, we don't need to always look at the US and see that the apocalyptic horsemen are coming. Did a good job in...
Yes, there is hope for Europe, I think, overall.
Thank you. So on that note, thank you.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. Thank you so much.